Chapter 14. Lysica's mood was brighter than it had been in a long time. Brighter than it had been in perhaps the past year or so. A weight she hadn't known had been weighing her down seemed to have lifted from her chest, leaving her with a spring in her step that even she noticed. She breathed in deep. For once the smell wasn't the pungent odour of the city, but rather held the scent of foods cooking, no doubt because they were still in the general vicinity of the Healer's Hall. Both Duran and Michaeline walked along with her as they headed back to the Order's Hall, and for a time nothing could impinge on her sense of goodwill and well-being. But like all things, even those feelings, despite how good it felt to experience them, had to end. That end had turned out to be when they got to the Odan's Hall and found that, to no one's surprise, there were no contracts to be found at the time. It was, after all, past the lunch hour, and even the laziest Odan member will have gotten themselves out of bed to get a decent contract by this time. "What about those?" Duran asked, pointing over at the far wall where a counter sat, on which sat several parchments of paper on them. She was about to snap at him, but before she did, she took a deep breath and let it out. After all, it was not his fault. He had just joined the Order, and had skipped all the orientations. Well, that part was perhaps his fault. "Those are not contracts," she explained, leaning against the wall next to the contract table and crossing her arms. As she did so, the upper portion of her brooch poked her slightly, so she shifted her arms slightly, so as to not press it into her at such an angle. Her mother had told her that it was always like that, no matter the location one were to put the brooch. If you moved just right, you would feel it press against you. But then she had gone on to tell her that such was not really an annoyance, that at a certain point it became a comfort. That might be true, but for Lysica, it was still in the annoyance stage. "No?" he asked. "No," she answered, pointing at the table. "Those are jobs. Jobs and contracts are different," she explained. Contracts are brought in by outsiders. They involve clearing paths, escorting someone somewhere, or practically anything. The person posting the contract pays half up front to the Order. 20% is removed from that half, and the remainder is provided to those who agree to take on the contract, so that the Order members can get supplies that they need before leaving. On completion, the second half is given to the Odan members, meaning they get 80% of the total reward paid. "Jobs are different," Michaeline said, smoothly inserting himself into the conversation. "As my cousin said, a contract is an external thing. Jobs, on the other hand, are internal. It's something you need to do for the Order. In fact, you are required to do a set amount of jobs a month. If you don't, you could get penalized for shirking your duties." "Jobs are almost exclusively escorts," Lysica said. "The Order operates in many places. Practically every major city has an Order Hall, and as such there are many resources that need to be traded from one location to the other, or to a craftsman." "That doesn't sound too bad," Duran said, looking at the two of them. "In fact, it sounds exactly like a contract, only it's the guild paying, not the person putting out the contract." "And that right there is the problem," Michaeline said. "It's one thing to put up with something boring or tedious when you know you are getting paid at the end of it, but with jobs there is no pay." "At the very least the board has to pay for your food and lodging, so you don't really lose anything but time," Lysica said, looking over at Duran, who looked like he was thinking hard about something. He nodded, and then looked up at the two of them. "How many of these a month do I have to do?" he asked. "5, Lysica said, and Duran nodded, walking over to the table to look at the jobs posted. Lysica looked at him and then over at Michaeline. "I already did mine, I'm not going," she said, crossing her arms. "Yeah, because it would be right and proper for a newly betrothed woman to be left to her own devices alone?" Michaeline snorted. "I know you, Lysica, you wouldn't do anything, but you know as well as I do that you cannot stay if he goes. You're in a prime courtship. You go where he goes. Me, on the other hand, are going as well. If I am to do so, then so will you." She narrowed her eyes at Michaeline. "Or would it be more right and proper to let an unwed woman out into the wilds without a chaperone?" she asked, her voice going sarcastically sweet and innocent. "Fine," he growled. "Let us go and be miserable together," she said with a sigh. Duran looked over the jobs. There were jobs asking for everything from delivering supplies in the city to different smiths and others, a few resource collection jobs, as well as some escorts. He picked up one and mentally mapped the route that the escort would take. It was a direction he had never been in, and the thought of getting to see more of the world was exciting. He walked it over to the counter, ready to hand it over when Lysica spoke, not to him, but to Michaeline. "Did you see which one he grabbed?" she asked, and as he handed it over to the woman standing behind the counter. "No, I didn't watch him, did you?" Michaeline asked. Lysica shook her head. "I'm not supposed to watch him," she snapped back at him. "The hell you're not!" Michaeline crossed his arms and looked down at her, their stances almost mirroring one another. "My job is to watch you. He's your husband. You're supposed to mind him." He's not my husband, he is my betrothed, and that only happened this morning, she snapped back. Technicalities, Michaeline said with a wave of his hand. Thank you for doing your guild duty, the woman behind the counter said with a smile that Durin gave back to her. The caravan will be leaving at dawn tomorrow, she said. Oh, goddess, give us strength, Michaeline bit out, looking at Lysica, who just groaned in response. Durin opened his eyes, stretching as he got out of bed and padded over to the window. Lady Yena had demanded that he stay the night despite his attempts to beg off after dinner. As such, he had put him in a guest room, across the hall from where Michaeline slept when he was staying with them. The room was rather spacious and nice. There was a four-poster bed to the right side, the posts carved intricately with stylized forest motif, complete with deer and other woodland creatures, all of which were carved with exquisite details. The floor was stone, though sections of it were covered in woven rugs of reds and whites, and on the walls hung some tapestries depicting what looked to be battles on a few, as well as some just showing scenes of nature. There was a fireplace in the corner with two overstuffed clawfoot armchairs, though no fire was going in it at the time. The space itself was much larger than what he had grown up in. It wasn't quite to the size where you could fit the old man's house in it, but it wasn't that much smaller either. Durin quickly got dressed and made sure he had his pack and sword strapped on securely before glancing out the window again. It was still dark, but the horizon was just turning a lighter shade. Nodding to himself, he stepped out into the hallway, which was dark and deserted at this time of the morning. He walked quietly across the hall and opened the door, stepping into Michaeline's room. He had been expecting to find him clothed and ready to go, or perhaps still asleep. Durin had not been expecting that the moment he opened the door, and it made a rather hideous creaking sound, to find Michaeline diving out of bed, snatching both sword and pants, as he rolled to put something between the door and himself. Durin had also not been expecting to find someone else in his bed, but there was the maid, Roxella, wearing not a scrap of clothing, eyes wide with shock at having been so awoken, and clutching a thin blanket up to her chest. Durin looked first at her, then over at Michaeline, who was only now blinking his eyes. The unfocused look of his gaze telling Durin that the previous movement had been all reactionary and instinctual, which in Durin's opinion was quite impressive. To learn as of such would require countless hours of effort. The fact that he had done so practically in his sleep told him that Michaeline had doubtlessly had similar encounters. Apologies, Durin said, letting the door shut behind him. I had not expected you would wake up so... He shrugged. Explosively. What time is it? He asked, looking over at the window and then looking back at Durin incredulously. It's not even dawn. He didn't shout, not quite, but his voice was raised nonetheless. We have to be at the gate at dawn, which means we need to get up before dawn, Durin said slowly, like he was talking to a small child or a simple person. But, goddess damn it, he snarled. I'm too damn tired for this shit, he groaned, glancing over at the maid, who was now fully awake and looking horrified at the fact that two men were conversing there, in front of her, while she lay naked in the bed with naught but a cover for her modesty. Not knowing how to respond to that, as Durin was now well aware as to why Michaeline was so tired, he decided to change the subject to safer matters. I suppose congratulations are in order, Durin said, looking away from the brightly blushing woman and back to Michaeline. For what? Michaeline was looking very confused now. For your decision to pursue marriage with Mistress Roxella, Durin said with a shrug. What? No, I'm not going to marry her, Michaeline said with a confused look on his face. But Lady Yenna said... Before Durin could finish, there was a rustle of cloth and the maid was on her feet, holding the sheet to her chest and grabbing angrily at her clothing, tears brimming in her eyes. Well, Michaeline, she said sharply as she stood, her clothing now held to her chest, this is goodbye. I refuse to be used and toyed with. And with that, she turned on her heels and walked out of the door, trailing the sheet she was wrapped in along like it was the train of a dress. No, wait, Roxy, Michaeline said, his arm outstretched almost like he was trying to grab her, but she was too far away and out of the door without pause. He turned to look at Durin. But I thought, no. He held up a hand to forestall Durin's words. Just go, please, he said. His voice sounded defeated and dejected. We need to leave in 30 minutes, Durin said, as he backed towards the door. Fine, Michaeline responded, sitting down on the bed and restoring his face in his hands. I'll be there. He closed the door behind himself and turned to regard the doorway free down the hall. That was Lysica's door. He slowly walked to it and was about to open it when he remembered what had happened when he had simply opened Michaeline's door. He knew she wouldn't have another in her bed, but she might be as unprepared to receive him as Michaeline had been. Opting instead to be more cautious, Duran knocked, the sound loud to his ears amid the sleeping silence. No response came from the room, so he did it again, and once more there was no answer. The third time he knocked harder and more insistently, and from the other side of the wooden door he heard Liska curse something before raising her voice in what sounded like a scream. Wrrr! Duran had no idea what she had actually said. It could have been, "What?" or really anything else, but he had gotten the tone of the word, whatever it was, and it sent a chill down his spine with its promise of violence. Opening the door slowly, he found her in bed, covered in a tangled mess of covers, and though he knew that she would be alone, the sight still caused him a great amount of relief to see there was no way another was in the room. The relief washed away when he saw Liska herself. She was still laying down, her head on the pillow and a single eye cracked to look at him. That eye reflected the dim light from the hall and seemed to glow, though it likely did not need the light to do so, seeing as there was a fire of anger ablaze in its depth. That single blue sapphire eye stared daggers into him, and he got the impression that even with his better swordsmanship, if he did not step lightly here, she would slice him to ribbons. "It is almost time to go," he said, only his head sticking through the crack. "We leave in 30 minutes. She didn't say a word as he pulled his head back into the hallway. Back into safety, she continued to glare at his retreating form with a single, icy, blue eye.